The negotiations had been going in circles for 6 hours straight. Thessera felt the familiar weight of frustration settling into her shoulders as she watched the VRYNN representative slam his palm against the table for the third time that afternoon. Across from him, the Antari diplomat's skin had shifted to that particular shade of orange that meant he was about to walk out of the room entirely. "We cannot accept these terms," the VRYNN growled, his crystalline features catching the light in sharp angles. "The mining rights to Sector 7 have belonged to our people for generations. Your generations are not our problem," the Antari shot back. "The resources are in neutral space. First claim, first rights." Thessera raised one clawed hand, her obsidian scales gleaming under the embassy lights. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should take a break and reconvene tomorrow morning. Fresh perspectives might serve us better." Both diplomats agreed with visible relief. They gathered their data tablets and left the conference room in opposite directions, refusing even to share the same hallway. Thessera remained seated for a long moment after they departed, staring at the holographic star chart that showed the disputed territories glowing in angry red. 3 decades she had been doing this work. 3 decades of building bridges between species who seemed determined to burn them down. She was good at her job, everyone said so, but lately, every treaty felt like pushing water uphill. The door chimed softly. Thessera looked up to see her assistant, a young Melodri with worried eyes. "Ambassador, your children are not in their educational pod." Thessera's wings twitched with annoyance. "Again? Where are they this time?" "Environmental maintenance thinks they saw them near the garden sections." Of course they were. Corian and Lissa had developed an unfortunate habit of escaping their lessons to explore the embassy's less populated areas. Thessera stood, her tail swishing behind her as she made her way through the corridors toward the environmental wings. The embassy was a massive structure, housing diplomatic quarters for 47 different species. Each section maintained its own atmospheric conditions, temperature ranges, and even gravity settings. The garden zones served as neutral ground where various plant species from across known space were cultivated, both for food production and for the psychological comfort of homesick diplomats. Thessera found the gardens quieter than usual. The main greenhouse stretched out before her, divided into sections by climate control barriers. She could see earth plants in one area, their green leaves so different from the silver foliage of her homeworld. Beyond that, the purple blooms of Antari flora, and further still, the crystalline structures that pass for vegetation on VRYNN. Movement caught her eye near the earth section. 2 small dragon shapes, scales still showing the soft rainbow sheen of youth, were crouched behind a cluster of broadleaf plants. Her children, watching something with intense focus. Thessera approached silently, using the natural stealth that came with her species. She positioned herself behind a support pillar where she could observe without being seen. A human knelt in the soil, his hands working carefully around the base of a struggling plant. Owen Bradford, if she remembered correctly. He had been hired 6 months ago to maintain the botanical sections. Thessera had met him briefly during his orientation, but had paid little attention since. Humans were common enough on the station, working in various support roles. Owen worked with deliberate slowness, examining each leaf, testing the soil between his fingers. He wore simple work clothes stained with dirt, and his hair was touched with gray at the temples. Nothing about him seemed particularly remarkable. "Why are you moving that one?" Lissa's voice piped up suddenly. Thessera tensed, ready to intervene, but Owen didn't startle. He glanced at her daughter with a slight smile. "This frost vine isn't happy where it is," he said, his voice quiet and measured. "See how the leaves are turning brown at the edges?" Corian crawled closer, his bright eyes examining the plant. "Is it sick?" "Not sick, just stressed. It's planted too close to this sunbloom here." Owen gestured to the neighboring plant, which did seem to be thriving with vibrant orange petals. "They need very different things. The frost vine wants cold and shade. The sunbloom wants heat and bright light. The previous gardener thought they would look nice together, but plants don't care about looking nice. They care about surviving. So they're fighting." Lissa asked, Not fighting exactly, but they can't both get what they need in the same space. Not without help. Owen sat back on his heels. That's what I'm here for, to help different things grow in the same place. Thessera found herself leaning forward, listening more carefully. Something about the way Owen spoke reminded her of something, though she couldn't quite place what. Can I help? Corian asked eagerly. Owen considered this seriously. Can you be patient? Plants teach you patience if you let them. Both children nodded enthusiastically. Owen handed each of them a small tool and began showing them how to loosen soil without damaging roots. He spoke in simple terms, never talking down to them, never rushing his explanations. Thessera watched for nearly an hour as her children worked alongside the human gardener. They asked endless questions. Owen answered each one with the same careful attention. When Lissa accidentally broke a stem, he didn't scold her, but showed her how the plant would heal itself given time. Will they be friends now? Corian asked as they finished transplanting the frost vine to a shadier location. The two plants. Owen smiled. They don't need to be friends. They just need to have space to be themselves. Sometimes that's enough. Thessera felt something shift in her chest. She looked at the frost vine and the sunbloom, species from two worlds that had just been at each other's throats in her conference room. And here they were, in a garden, learning to exist side by side, because someone had taken the time to understand what each one needed. She stepped out from behind the pillar. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Her children looked guilty, expecting punishment for skipping their lessons. But Thessera was looking at Owen Bradford, seeing him properly for the first time. Tomorrow, she said slowly, I would like to speak with you. Privately. Owen nodded, brushing soil from his hands. The garden will be here. Thessera collected her children and led them back toward their quarters. Behind them, the human returned to his work among the plants, patient and unhurried. For the first time in weeks, Thessera felt something other than frustration. She felt curious. Owen was trimming dead leaves from a cluster of melodry, singing vines when Thessera found him the next morning. The vines hummed softly as he worked, responding to the careful attention with pleased musical notes. He didn't look up at her approach, but spoke anyway. Your children have good instincts for this work. They notice things. Thessera settled her bulk onto a nearby bench designed to accommodate larger species. They should have been in their studies yesterday. I apologize for the interruption. Wasn't an interruption. Owen moved to the next vine, his movements economical and precise. They were learning, just not what you had planned for them to learn. You don't mind them watching you work. Plants don't care who watches. Neither do I. He finally looked at her, meeting her eyes with a directness that surprised her. Most species found dragon eye contact intimidating. You wanted to talk? Thessera gestured toward the section where he had worked yesterday. The frost vine and sunbloom were now separated by several meters, each in their own climate zone. That plant combination, the VRYN frost vine and the Antari sunbloom, was the placement deliberate? Owen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Yes, you've been following the treaty negotiations. Hard not to. Every diplomat on the station complains about it in one language or another. He set down his trimming shears and faced her fully. Plants are easier than politics. They tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen. The previous gardener, Thessera said carefully, he planted them together. He thought it would be symbolic. Unity through diversity. Pretty words. Owen's voice carried a hint of something bitter. But he didn't understand what he was working with. Just forced 2 incompatible things into the same space and expected them to figure it out. They were killing each other slowly, and you separated them. I created conditions where both could thrive. That's different from separation. Owen walked toward the plants, and Thessera followed. Look here, the climate barrier I installed. It's not a wall. It's a gradient. The frost vine gets its cold and shade. The sunbloom gets its heat and light. But in between, there's a zone where the conditions meet. Neither plant will grow there, but it serves a purpose. What purpose? Buffer space. Room for adaptation. Maybe one day, hybrid species will develop that can handle both conditions. Maybe not, but forcing them together before they're ready just guarantees failure. He touched the barrier controls, showing her the temperature gradients on a small display. Every species has non-negotiable needs. You can't compromise on those, but you can create space for them to exist without conflict. Sarah stared at the barrier system, her mind racing. You said you were a gardener. I am a gardener, but you weren't always. Owen was quiet for a long moment. The singing vines behind them shifted their tune to something lower, more contemplative. Finally, he spoke. I used to mediate colony disputes, human settlements on contested worlds, border conflicts, resource allocation, cultural clashes. I was good at it. He paused, or I thought I was. Then I pushed too hard for a compromise between two groups. Made them share a settlement because it seemed fair on paper. 18 people died in the fighting that followed. 18 people who would still be alive if I had understood that some things can't be forced. So you stopped. I stopped trying to make people compromise on things that mattered to their survival. Started working with plants instead. They're honest about what they need. A frost vine doesn't pretend it can handle heat just to make peace. It tells you exactly what it requires to live. Sarah felt the weight of his words. The VRYNN and Antari situation. You see it in these plants. I see two species with fundamental environmental differences trying to occupy the same space. Your treaty proposals keep trying to split the difference. Share the mining rights. Alternate schedules. Joint oversight. Owen shook his head, but that's not what either side actually needs. The VRYNN need cold processing facilities because of their crystalline biology. The Antari need high-heat refineries because their technology runs on thermal differentials. You can't compromise on biology. Then what do you suggest? Stop trying to make them share what can't be shared. Zone the territories by environmental requirements. Let the VRYNN take the cold sectors where their equipment works best. Let the Antari take the hot sectors where theirs thrives. Create buffer zones in between for trade and communication. They'll say that's not fair. That one side gets more valuable territory. Fair is a human concept that doesn't translate well. Owen returned to his work, picking up the shears again. What matters is whether both sides can thrive. Sometimes that means unequal division. This sunbloom has 3 times the space of the frost vine, but that's what each needs to be healthy. Fair doesn't enter into it. Sarah watched him work for several minutes, processing what he had said. In the distance, she could hear her children's voices. They were approaching, and she realized they must have escaped their lessons again. Corian and Lissa bounded into view, stopping short when they saw their mother was still there. We finished our morning studies, Lissa said quickly, which was probably only partly true. Owen glanced at Sarah with the ghost of a smile. I could use assistance today, planning to redesign the central garden. It's been dying for months because nobody understood what was planted there. May we? Corian asked, looking between Owen and his mother. Sarah should have said no, should have sent them back to their proper education. But something made her nod instead. What will you teach them today? She asked Owen. How to observe before acting. How to identify what something truly needs versus what it's asking for. How to create conditions for growth instead of forcing it. He handed each child a data tablet. First lesson is mapping the current garden. Every plant species, every climate setting, every failure point. Can't solve a problem until you understand it completely. The children eagerly accepted the tablets and rushed off to begin their survey. Sarah remained on the bench, watching Owen gather his tools. You're teaching them how to think, she said quietly. I'm teaching them how to pay attention. The thinking comes naturally after that. He paused at the garden entrance. Your meeting with the VRYNN and Antari delegates is at 3rd hour, isn't it? How did you know that? Embassy schedule is public. Also, you have that look people get before difficult conversations. He met her eyes again. Remember about the buffer zones. Sometimes the empty space between things is what makes everything else possible. Then he was gone, following her children deeper into the gardens. Sarah sat alone among the thriving plants, surrounded by dozens of species that should have been incompatible but were somehow flourishing side by side. She pulled up the treaty proposals on her data tablet and began to rewrite them, thinking about frost vines and sunblooms and the wisdom of knowing when to stop forcing things together. The VRYN delegate stared at the revised proposal, as if Thessera had handed him a live explosive. Across the conference table, the Antari representative wore a similar expression of confusion mixed with suspicion. "You want to give us the entire northern sector?" the VRYN asked slowly. "All 16 mining platforms. The northern sector maintains average temperatures below freezing. Your processing equipment operates optimally in those conditions. It makes sense for your people to control that territory." Thessera pulled up a holographic map showing the color-coded zones. The southern sector, with its volcanic activity and high thermal output, would fall under Antari jurisdiction. Their refineries need that heat. "And what do we give up for this?" the Antari asked, his skin shifting to suspicious purple. "Nothing. You give up nothing. You gain optimal working conditions for your technology." Thessera expanded the map to show the middle regions. These temperate zones remain neutral space. Trade stations, communication hubs, joint research facilities. Places where both your peoples can interact without environmental stress. "This isn't equal division," the VRYN said flatly. "No, it isn't. The southern sector has more platforms, but the northern sector has richer mineral deposits. Different advantages for different needs." Thessera met his eyes calmly. "Equal doesn't mean identical. It means both sides get what they actually require to succeed." The two delegates looked at each other for the first time in weeks without open hostility. They looked confused instead, which Thessera decided was progress. "I need to consult with my government," the Antari said. "As do I," the VRYN agreed. "Take your time. Study the proposal. Bring your technical experts. Make sure the environmental zones actually match your operational needs." Thessera closed the holographic display. "I'll be in the gardens if you have questions." She left them sitting together, still looking puzzled, but no longer quite so angry. It was a Stardet in the embassy gardens. She found her children covered in dirt and completely absorbed in their work. Over the past week, they had been cataloging every plant in the Central Garden section, and Owen had been teaching them to identify problems by observation. "This cluster here," Corian was saying, pointing to a group of wilting plants. "They're all from high humidity worlds. But the climate system is set for dry. That's why they're dying. And these," Lissa added, gesturing to another section, "they need acidic soil, but they're planted in alkaline. The roots can't absorb nutrients properly." Owen sat on the ground between them, his own tablet showing complex environmental data. "Good. Now tell me why the previous designer made these mistakes." "Because they didn't study what each plant needed." Corian ventured. "Deeper than that. Look at the pattern. What do you see?" Thessera moved closer, curious about where Owen was leading them. Lissa studied the garden layout on her tablet, her young brow furrowed in concentration. They grouped plants by color. All the blue ones together, all the red ones together. They wanted it to look pretty. Exactly. They prioritized appearance over function. Made decisions based on what looked good to them rather than what would actually work. Owen stood, brushing off his pants. "This is the most common mistake in design, politics, and life. Choosing what seems nice over what's necessary. So how do we fix it?" Corian asked. "We start over. Group by compatible needs. Humidity lovers together. Acid soil plants together. Sun seekers in bright areas, shade lovers in dark ones. It won't look like the original design. It might not look pretty at all at first, but everything will be healthy. Can we do that?" Lissa looked uncertain. "Completely change it. It's already dying. Can't make it worse." Owen pulled up a blank design template. "Here's your project. Redesign this whole section. Use everything you've learned. Make it work first, then make it beautiful. Those should be in that order, always." The children dove into the project with enthusiasm. Thessera watched them work, saw how they consulted their data, debated placement options, tested their theories against environmental requirements. They had learned more in a week with Owen than in months of formal education. "They're good at this," she said quietly, coming to stand beside Owen. "They're good at learning. That's different from being good at a thing." He was silent for a moment. "How did your meeting go?" "They're considering it." Both sides seemed less angry, more confused. Confusion is better than anger. Means they're actually thinking instead of just reacting. Owen gestured to a nearby plant, one with strange spiral leaves. This is a compromise plant. It was bred to survive in moderate conditions that satisfied no one. Looks exotic, but it's weak, susceptible to disease. Can't reproduce naturally. Has to be cloned in labs. A lesson. Sometimes trying to meet in the middle creates something that can't sustain itself. He moved to the next plant, a hardy bush with thick leaves. This one grows on a moon with barely any atmosphere. Harsh radiation, extreme temperatures, almost no water. It's thriving here because I gave it conditions similar to home. Not identical, but close enough. It doesn't need compromise. It needs understanding. Over the following days, Thessera found herself spending more time in the gardens than in her office. She watched Owen teach her children about root systems that communicated through chemical signals, about pollinator relationships where different species depended on each other without competition, about how stress could make some plants stronger while it killed others, and knowing the difference was essential. Other embassy children began appearing. A young Melodri whose parents worked in communications. Two Antari siblings whose father was a cultural attaché. A VRYN child whose mother served on the Security Council. They were drawn by curiosity, stayed because Owen treated them all with the same patient attention. He taught them to see patterns, to identify true needs versus stated wants, to create conditions for success rather than forcing predetermined outcomes. He never mentioned diplomacy or politics, but every lesson applied to both. Thessera watched a small miracle unfold. Children from species whose governments couldn't agree on anything were working together to redesign a garden. They debated plant placement with passion, but without anger. They compromised when possible and found creative alternatives when compromise wouldn't work. They learned each other's languages through necessity and formed friendships through shared purpose. The central garden slowly transformed from a dying showcase into a living laboratory. It wasn't beautiful yet, but it was working. And the children knew why it was working, which mattered more. 2 weeks after she had presented her revised proposal, both the VRYNN and Antari governments sent responses. They wanted to negotiate details, but they had accepted the basic premise. Zone by need, not by equal division. Create buffer spaces for interaction. Let each species thrive in conditions that suited them. The treaty wouldn't be simple, but it had a chance now. A real chance. Thessera found Owen in the early evening, watching the children plant the last section of their redesigned garden. "You did this," she said simply. "I grew some plants. You taught a new way of thinking." Owen smiled slightly. "I taught observation. Everything else is just paying attention to what's really there." The treaty signing was scheduled for third cycle next month, but the real work was just beginning. Thessera spent long hours drafting implementation protocols with technical experts from both sides. The atmospheric scientists, mining engineers, and environmental specialists all had opinions about how to divide the territories properly. What surprised her most was how reasonable everyone became once they stopped fighting over equal division and started discussing actual needs. The VRYNN engineers happily ceded the hot southern platforms once they understood they could have exclusive rights to the cold processing facilities. The Antari thermal specialists were thrilled to get volcanic territories that had previously been considered worthless. The buffer zones proved trickier. Both sides wanted to control trade station locations, communication relay positions, and research outpost sites. But even these negotiations moved faster than the previous months of deadlock. Meanwhile, in the embassy gardens, something unexpected was happening. The children's redesigned central garden had attracted attention. Diplomats walking through the area stopped to look at the thriving plants, so different from the dying showcase that had been there before. They asked questions. The children answered, explaining their reasoning with enthusiasm. Word spread. More embassy staff brought their children to see what was happening. The garden project grew from a single section to 3, then 5. Owen found himself supervising a small army of young botanists from a dozen different species. Thessera watched her own children change day by day. Corian developed patience she had never seen in him before. He would sit and observe a struggling plant for an hour, taking notes, testing theories, waiting for understanding. Lissa became confident in ways that formal education had never given her. She would explain complex environmental systems to adults twice her size. Without hesitation, one afternoon, Thessera arrived at the garden to find Owen teaching the children about symbiotic relationships. He had set up a small, enclosed ecosystem showing how certain fungi provided nutrients to plant roots while the plants provided sugars to the fungi in return. Neither one could survive alone in this environment, Owen explained. But together, they both thrive. This is different from compromise. This is complementary relationship. Each one does what it's best at, and both benefit. A young Antari child raised her hand. Like how my mother uses VRYNN data processors because their crystalline structure is better at calculations, and VRYNN use our thermal batteries because we're better at energy storage. Exactly like that. Owen smiled. Your peoples have been trading specialized goods for decades. You already know how to benefit from each other's strengths. The conflict over mining rights made you forget that. My father says our governments are stupid. A VRYNN boy added matter-of-factly. Not stupid, just focused on the wrong things. Fighting over equal division instead of optimal function. Owen pulled up a holographic model of a root system. Look at how these roots spread. Not equal in all directions. They grow toward water, toward nutrients, toward what they need. Nature doesn't care about fair. Nature cares about what works. Thessera felt a presence beside her and turned to find the Antari delegate, the same man who had been slamming his palms on her conference table just weeks ago. He was watching the children with an expression she couldn't quite read. My daughter is here 3 times a week now, he said quietly. She talks about plants at dinner, tells me about climate zones and symbiotic relationships. They're learning valuable skills. She's learning to think. He gestured toward where his daughter was working alongside a VRYNN child, both of them carefully transplanting a delicate flowering vine. Last week, she asked me why governments can't be designed like gardens. I didn't have a good answer. Thessera watched the 2 children work together with easy cooperation. Your negotiating team has been more reasonable lately. Hard to stay unreasonable when your child comes home excited about helping VRYNN plants grow. He shook his head slowly. She doesn't understand why I was fighting so hard to keep them out of the southern territories. Asked me if it would be better for everyone if each species got what they were good at instead of fighting over equal shares. What did you tell her? That she was right. That sometimes children see things more clearly than adults. He paused. The human gardener. Owen. Who is he really? A man who understands how to make different things grow together. He's teaching our children a philosophy. He's teaching them to observe and adapt. I wouldn't call that philosophy. I call it survival skills. The delegate watched Owen show the children how to test soil composition, his movements patient and precise. My government wants to know if this approach can be replicated. Other conflicts, other territories. You want to hire him? We want to understand his methods. Turn them into policy. The Antari turned to face her fully. The treaty you proposed, these zone divisions, this focus on optimal function over equal distribution. It's not traditional diplomacy. Traditional diplomacy was failing. Yes, it was. He looked back at the children. This is something new, something that might actually work in the long term. 2 weeks before the signing ceremony, the children made a request. They wanted to present their garden work at the treaty event. Owen brought the idea to Thessera with visible reluctance. It's their project, he said. They did the work, made the decisions, learned the lessons. They should get to show it. The signing ceremony is a formal diplomatic event. Very traditional, very structured. I know. That's why I'm asking permission instead of just letting them do it. Owen met her eyes. But these children created something real. They solve a problem that symbolizes exactly what the treaty is trying to achieve. That seems worth recognizing. Thessera considered it. The idea was unusual, possibly inappropriate by diplomatic standards. But something about it felt right in a way that formal speeches and official pronouncements never did. I'll propose it to both delegations. They may refuse. They didn't refuse. Both the VRYNN and Antari representatives agreed, perhaps because their own children were involved, perhaps because they were curious to see what had captured so much of their children's attention. The garden continued to grow and flourish. The children worked with focused intensity, preparing their presentation, perfecting their explanations. They practiced showing adults how to read environmental data, how to identify compatible species, how to create conditions for mutual success. Owen watched them with quiet satisfaction, offering guidance, but letting them lead. Sarah realized he had been preparing them for this all along. Not just teaching them about plants, but teaching them how to teach others. The treaty signing would happen in the garden itself. The children's garden, a space they had transformed from dying showcase into living proof that different species could thrive side by side when someone took the time to understand what each one actually needed. The IT wasn't traditional. It wasn't formal, but it was honest, and it was working, and sometimes that mattered more than following protocol. The morning of the signing ceremony arrived with perfect weather, or at least as perfect as a space station could simulate. The central garden had been transformed completely from its dying state 3 months ago. Where there had been wilting plants struggling in wrong conditions, there now thrive clusters of healthy vegetation grouped by compatible needs. Climate barriers shimmer faintly between sections, maintaining optimal conditions for each species without walls or separation. Delegates and embassy staff gathered in the garden's main plaza. The formal signing table had been set up on a raised platform, surrounded by the thriving plants the children had so carefully arranged. Sarah stood with the VRYNN and Antari representatives, all 3 of them in formal diplomatic attire. Behind them, screens displayed the treaty documents that would end months of conflict. But before the official ceremony began, the children took their positions. 15 of them in total from 6 different species. Corian and Lissa stood at the front, flanked by the VRYNN boy and Antari girl who had become their closest collaborators. Owen remained at the back of the gathering, almost invisible among the adult diplomats. Corian spoke first, his young voice carrying clearly through the garden's natural acoustics. 3 months ago, this garden was dying. We were asked why, and our first answer was disease or pests. We were wrong. Lissa continued. The garden was dying because someone had designed it to look pretty without understanding what each plant needed to live. They put frost vines next to sun blooms, acid-loving plants in alkaline soil, desert species next to marsh plants. Everything was struggling. The VRYNN child, whose name was Thurin, gestured to a holographic display showing before and after layouts. We mapped every plant and every failure point. We studied environmental requirements, soil chemistry, light needs, temperature ranges, humidity levels. Not what we wanted the plants to need, but what they actually required to survive. Then we redesigned everything, the Antari girl, Cirrus, added. We grouped compatible species together, created zones with optimal conditions, built buffer areas where different environments could meet without forcing plants to adapt to wrong conditions. The children began walking through the garden, pointing out specific examples. They showed how frost vines now thrived in a cold zone maintained at sub-zero temperatures, how sun blooms flourished in bright, hot sections that would kill most other species, how dozens of different plant varieties coexisted in the same physical space by respecting each other's fundamental needs. This section here, Corian explained, stopping beside a cluster of beautiful flowering plants. These are all from worlds with similar conditions. They share water, nutrients, and space efficiently because they need the same things. No competition, no conflict. In this section, Lissa said, moving to a different area where plants looked completely different, these need opposite conditions. But see the barrier system? The gradient zones? They can grow side by side because we created space for both to have what they need. Thurin pulled up data on the holographic display, showing growth rates and health metrics. Every plant in this garden is healthier now than 3 months ago. Many are reproducing naturally, which they couldn't do before. Some have even formed symbiotic relationships we didn't plan for. They found ways to help each other once they had the right conditions. Cirrus looked directly at the assembled diplomats. We learned something important doing this work. Equal treatment doesn't mean identical treatment. These two plants get different amounts of water because they need different amounts. That's not unfair. That's understanding reality. The presentation continued with each child contributing their observations and insights. They spoke about how they had learned to identify true needs versus surface complaints, how they had discovered that solving root problems eliminated most conflicts, how they had found that spending time to understand something deeply made solutions obvious that had seemed impossible before. A Melodri child demonstrated the climate barrier technology, showing how it created gradients rather than hard borders. Our parents fight about borders, she said with the blunt honesty of youth. But borders in nature aren't lines. They're zones where things gradually change. That's what we built here. As the presentation reached its conclusion, Corian and Lysis stood together again. We want to show you one more thing, Corian said. He led the group to a specific section where a VRYN ice moss and an Antari heat fern were growing almost side by side, separated only by a narrow climate barrier that shimmered between them. This should be impossible, Lyssa explained. These species need completely opposite conditions. But watch. She adjusted the barrier controls, widening the gradient zone between the two plants. In this middle space, conditions are constantly changing. Not stable enough for either species to grow. But it serves a purpose. What purpose? Someone in the crowd asked. Durin stepped forward. My people are crystalline. We process information through cold temperature reactions. I can explain it to warm species, but they don't really understand because they don't experience cold the same way. Cirrus continued the thought. And my people experience heat as data. Temperature differentials are how we think. I can't fully understand crystalline processing because my biology doesn't work that way. But in this gradient zone, Corian said, both types of information exist. Temperature ranges that include both cold and heat. A place where both ways of processing make sense, even though neither species could live there. Communication space, Lyssa finished. Not where you live, but where you can meet and understand each other. The garden fell silent. Thessera watched as adult diplomats processed what the children had just demonstrated. They had built a physical model of the treaty itself, zones for each species to thrive in their own way, and spaces between for cooperation and communication. The VRYNN representative stepped forward slowly. His crystalline features caught the light as he knelt beside the ice moss, examining it closely. This is healthier than any I've seen outside our homeworld. The Antari delegate joined him, looking at the heat fern with equal interest. As is this. They're thriving because they have optimal conditions, not compromised ones. We wanted to show you that it works, Cirrus said quietly. Different species, different needs, same space. No conflict when everyone gets what they actually require. Owen had taught them well. They had learned not just botany, but wisdom. They had understood that the garden was always meant to be a lesson, and they had made themselves into teachers. The VRYNN representative straightened, looking at Thessera. Perhaps we should proceed with the signing. The formal ceremony that followed felt almost anticlimactic after the children's presentation. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, official photographs were taken. But everyone present knew the real moment had already happened. The moment when children had shown adults how to see their conflict differently. As the crowd dispersed, Thessera found Owen standing beside a young sapling, one the children had planted just that morning. You planned this from the beginning. I planned to teach children about plants. They chose what to learn from it. He touched the sapling gently. This one won't be fully grown for years, but it's planted in the right place now. That's what matters. Thessera watched her children accepting congratulations from various diplomats, their faces bright with pride and accomplishment. They had changed in 3 months, grown in ways that had nothing to do with size. What you did here, she said slowly, it's bigger than one treaty. Maybe, but I just tend gardens. Owen smiled slightly. The growing happens on its own, once conditions are right. For months after the treaty signing, Thessera received an offer that would have thrilled her a year ago. Chief mediator for the Galactic Council. The position represented the pinnacle of diplomatic achievement, coordinating peace efforts across dozens of species and hundreds of territories. She sat in her office staring at the formal invitation, feeling nothing like excitement. The VRY Treaty had worked. Better than anyone expected. The zone divisions based on environmental needs rather than equal distribution had created a framework where both species thrived. Mining operations ran more efficiently. Trade between the two peoples had increased. Most importantly, the constant low-level hostility had evaporated once each side stopped feeling cheated. Point 3 Other regional conflicts had requested Thesara's consultation. They wanted to understand her methods, implement similar zone-based solutions. The diplomatic community was calling it a revolution in treaty design. But Thesara kept thinking about the garden. She found Owen where she always did, working among the plants. Today he was training a new group of children, these ones from a recently arrived delegation of Pelthian diplomats. Their home system was in dispute with two neighboring species over asteroid mining rights. The children watched Owen demonstrate proper soil testing with the same fascination Corian and Lissa had shown months ago. Her own children were there too, but now they were helping teach rather than learning. Corian was explaining climate barrier technology to a young Pelthian who kept asking why the different plant sections couldn't just share the same temperature. Lissa was showing another group how to map environmental needs before attempting any design work. They're good teachers, Thesara said, coming to stand beside Owen. They understand the principles. That makes teaching possible. He finished his demonstration and sent the children off to practice their soil tests. I heard about the council position. Congratulations. I haven't accepted yet. Why not? It's what you've worked toward your whole career. Thesara watched her children move through the garden with confidence and purpose. Because I'm not sure that's what matters anymore. Owen waited, not pushing, just listening in his patient way. The treaty work, the zone divisions, the environmental approach to conflict resolution. It's working, but it's not my innovation. It's yours. She gestured at the thriving garden around them. All I did was apply what you taught my children. You saw the application. That's not nothing. But it's not enough. Thesara struggled to articulate what had been growing in her mind for weeks. You're teaching a generation of children to think differently, to see cooperation where their parents see conflict, to understand that difference doesn't require competition. That's bigger than any treaty I could ever negotiate. So teach with me. The simple suggestion stopped her. What? The embassy school wants to create a new program. Ecological diplomacy, they're calling it. Combining environmental science with conflict resolution. They asked if I would head it. Owen smiled slightly. I said yes, but only if they could find someone with actual diplomatic experience to co-direct. Someone who understands both the theory and the practice. You want me to teach children? I want you to shape how the next generation of diplomats thinks. Show them what you learned. Help them understand that the tools for solving conflicts exist in nature if we know how to look. He gestured to where Corian was successfully explaining gradient zones to the confused Pelthian child. Your son just prevented a future war. That child will go home understanding that different species can have different needs in the same space. He'll carry that knowledge into adulthood. When his generation takes power, they won't make the same mistakes ours did. Thesara felt something shift in her chest. The chief mediator position would let her solve conflicts one at a time, applying garden principles to diplomatic crises. Important work, necessary work. But teaching would let her prevent those conflicts from arising in the first place. The council position is what I've always wanted, she said slowly. Wanted past tense. I think what I want changed. Somewhere between frost vines and sunblooms. She looked at Owen directly. You knew this would happen. When you let my children watch you work. When you taught them to see differently. You were teaching me, too. I was gardening. You chose what to learn. Don't deflect with humility. You're too good at this to pretend it's accidental. But she said it with affection, not accusation. You transformed my children. You transformed how I see conflict. You're transforming an entire generation of young diplomats. And you want to act like you're just a man who waters plants. Owen was quiet for a moment, watching the children work. I told you I left mediation because I pushed too hard for compromise. Made people share space when they needed separation. 18 people died because I didn't understand what I was working with. I remember. I can't bring them back, but I can teach others not to make the same mistakes. Not just my mistakes. All the mistakes that come from trying to force compatibility instead of creating conditions for it. He met her eyes. That work is more important than any single treaty. It's slower, less visible, harder to measure. But it's what changes everything. Sarah understood then. Owen hadn't retired from the work that mattered. He had found a deeper way to do it, and he was offering her the same opportunity. Over the following weeks, she declined the chief mediator position and accepted the co-directorship of the new ecological diplomacy program. The Galactic Council was disappointed. Her colleagues questioned her decision. Some suggested she was wasting her talents on children who might never become diplomats. But Sarah knew better. She was teaching children who would become leaders, scientists, engineers, parents, who would carry garden principles into every field they entered, who would build a future where conflicts were designed out rather than negotiated down. The program grew faster than anyone expected. Embassy families requested enrollment. Then diplomatic families from nearby systems sent their children specifically for the training. Within 6 months, there was a waiting list. Corian and Lissa thrived in ways formal education had never enabled. They became student teachers, then junior instructors, then started developing their own curriculum editions. They called it practical diplomacy, focusing on observation and adaptation rather than negotiation and compromise. One evening, Sarah found Owen in the original garden section, the place where everything had started. The frost vine and sunbloom were both flourishing, separated by their climate barrier, but coexisting peacefully in the same space. "I have a question," she said. "All right. That first day, when you let my children watch you work, did you know who they were? Did you know I was the diplomat handling the Virwin crisis?" Owen smiled. "Yes. So this was deliberate from the beginning. Teaching is always deliberate. What people learn from it is their own choice." He touched the frost vine gently. "I thought if I could show your children a different way to see conflict, maybe you'd see it too. Or maybe you wouldn't, and they just become good gardeners. Either outcome had value. You manipulated me. I offered information and let you decide what to do with it. That's teaching, not manipulation." He looked at her steadily. "Are you angry?" Sarah considered this seriously. "No, I am grateful. You gave my children a future better than anything I could have planned for them. You gave me work that matters more than prestige. You might have saved countless lives by teaching a generation to think differently about conflict." She paused. "But I reserve the right to be frustrated that you're better at this than I am. You'll catch up. You're a quick learner when you let yourself be." They stood together in the garden, surrounded by thriving plants and the sound of children's voices in the distance. The next class would start soon. More young minds ready to learn that difference didn't require conflict, that cooperation was stronger than compromise, that understanding needs mattered more than negotiating wants. Sarah thought about the chief mediator position she had declined. Someone else would take it, solve crises, negotiate treaties. Important work. But here in this garden, she was helping grow something that would make that work eventually unnecessary. Not in her lifetime, probably, but in her children's or their children's. Owen was right about something else too. The best gardener knew when to step back and trust what had been planted. She watched Corian leading a class through climate zone design, watched Lissa teaching observation protocols to students twice her age. They didn't need her guidance anymore. Not really. They had learned the principles and made them their own. The future was growing on its own now. All it had needed was the right conditions. And perhaps, Sarah thought, that was the most important lesson of all.